A parent's home is supposed to be the last place danger can reach you. It's where locks feel unnecessary, where routines feel familiar, where the walls have watched you grow, fail, and come back again. Susan Bailey believed that too. On the night she returned to her parents' house, nothing appeared out of place. The same rooms, the same sense of shelter. A space meant to protect her, not threaten her. Yet by the time help was called, that house had become something no family ever recovers from. This wasn't a break-in. There was no stranger forcing their way inside. No masked figure fleeing into the dark. Whatever happened came from within the home itself. The kind of betrayal that doesn't leave footprints outside, only questions that echo long after the doors are closed. Questions about trust, about what was ignored, and about how danger can hide behind familiarity until it's too late. Before we continue, take a moment to subscribe to True Crime Stories Chronicles and tell us in the comments where you're watching from around the world. Stories like this remind us how close tragedy can be to any home, because this wasn't a random act, and the signs weren't invisible. What investigators uncovered later would leave even seasoned detectives shaken. Susan Bailey didn't see herself as remarkable. She didn't talk about sacrifice as if it were heroic. For her, responsibility was simply what came next, day after day, whether she felt ready for it or not. By the time her marriage ended, Susan found herself carrying the full weight of her household alone. She was a working single mother, raising 2 children on an income that never stretched far enough. Bills arrived faster than paychecks, free time disappeared. Rest became a luxury she rarely allowed herself. Still, every decision she made came back to one priority: keeping her children safe, fed, and steady in a world that felt increasingly uncertain. Susan worked retail, often taking extra shifts, sometimes juggling more than one job just to stay afloat. She left the house early and came home late, not because she wanted distance, but because stability required it. While other parents might have had evenings free, Susan spent hers calculating expenses, deciding which needs had to come before wants. New clothes, electronics, and extras weren't ignored out of cruelty. They were postponed out of necessity. To her children, that absence felt personal. To Susan, it felt unavoidable. She didn't go out. She didn't chase new relationships. She didn't spend money on herself. The dreams she once had, of travel, of comfort, of something beyond survival, were quietly set aside. In their place was a strict routine built around responsibility. Curfews were enforced, spending was monitored. Rules mattered, not because Susan enjoyed laying them down, but because she believed structure was the only thing keeping everything from slipping apart. And yet, discipline and love don't always feel the same to those receiving them. Susan loved her children deeply, but she was firm. When money was wasted, she confronted it. When rules were broken, there were consequences. She expected understanding from teenagers who didn't yet have the life experience to see what she was protecting them from. In her mind, saying no was an act of care. In theirs, it felt like control. Inside the home, frustration grew quietly. Small arguments became frequent. Conversations turned sharp. The distance between intention and perception widened with every passing month. Susan believed she was holding everything together. But inside that home, something dangerous was already taking shape. For Susan's children, the world inside their home felt very different from the one their mother believed she was protecting. Teen years arrived with the usual storms: shifting emotions, impatience, and a growing desire to be seen as independent. But layered over that was something heavier: the feeling that life had suddenly narrowed, that choices were being made for them without their consent. From Susan's point of view, the rules were practical. Limits existed because money was tight. Oversight existed because she worried. Every restriction came from a place of fear about what could go wrong if she loosened her grip even slightly. She believed that guidance now would spare her children pain later. From the children's point of view, those same rules felt suffocating. They saw a mother who was rarely home, yet quick to say no. They didn't see long work hours, they saw absence. They didn't see sacrifice, they saw denial. Curfews felt arbitrary. Spending limits felt unfair. While their peers carried new phones and wore trendy clothes, Susan's children felt left behind, quietly embarrassed by what they couldn't have. Money became a constant source of tension. Susan carefully tracked expenses, knowing one mistake could unravel the household. The children, still learning how consequences unfold over time, treated those limits lightly. Phone usage climbed, time online increased. Small acts of defiance added up. When confronted, they didn't respond with understanding. They responded with resentment. Jennifer, the older of the two, had always been reserved, introspective, and independent by nature. She kept mostly to herself, preferred books and drawing, and rarely sought approval from others. But as she grew older, something shifted. Her grades slipped, her patience thinned. The quiet distance she once maintained turned into emotional withdrawal. David, younger and more impressionable, watched closely. He admired his sister and absorbed her frustrations. Where Susan saw teenage moodiness, a bond was forming between the siblings, one rooted in shared grievance. Complaints became conversations. Conversations became validation. Arguments at home grew more frequent. Not explosive, not dramatic, just persistent. Short replies, doors closing, eyes rolling when rules were mentioned. None of it seemed alarming on its own. To Susan, it looked like normal growing pains. To the children, it felt like proof they weren't being heard. The frustration didn't erupt outward. It settled inward, deepening quietly. Each disagreement left something unresolved. Each boundary reinforced a belief that their mother was the obstacle standing between them and the life they wanted. And this resentment wouldn't stay passive. When Paul Hansen entered Jennifer's life, the shift wasn't immediate. It didn't arrive loudly or violently. It came quietly, wrapped in attention and understanding, the kind that feels rare to a teenager already convinced no one at home truly listens. Paul was younger than Jennifer, but he carried himself with a confidence that felt unusual for his age. He didn't blend in with other boys at school. He spoke differently, thought differently. And to Jennifer, that difference felt meaningful. Where others felt shallow or predictable, Paul felt intense, complicated. Like someone who saw the world on a deeper level. Susan felt uneasy almost from the beginning. She couldn't point to a single moment or specific act that explained it. There was just a persistent sense that something was off. Paul didn't behave like other teenagers. His presence seemed to pull Jennifer inward, away from the structure Susan was trying to maintain. Conversations with her daughter became guarded. Questions were met with defensiveness. Time spent at home became something Jennifer tried to avoid. To Jennifer, Paul wasn't a threat. He was an escape. He validated every frustration she carried. When Jennifer complained about rules, Paul didn't challenge her perspective. He reinforced it. When she spoke about feeling misunderstood, he agreed. When she felt restricted, he framed it as injustice. Slowly, subtly, he positioned himself not just as a boyfriend, but as the one person who truly understood her. Paul's influence didn't stop there. He began sharing elaborate beliefs about identity and existence, presenting them as truths few people were capable of grasping. He spoke about having more than one self, separate identities with separate desires, and insisted this explained his behavior. To Jennifer, this wasn't alarming. It felt profound, mysterious, something that set him apart from everyone else. Susan saw the effects before she understood the cause. Jennifer's focus shifted entirely toward Paul. School plans faded into the background. Her interest in art, once central to her identity, lost priority. Rules at home were no longer just boundaries. They were obstacles keeping her from where she felt she belonged. When Susan tried to intervene, the resistance was immediate and fierce. Paul didn't demand Jennifer cut ties with her family outright. He didn't need to. Instead, he reframed authority as opposition. He encouraged secrecy, reinforced the idea that outsiders, especially parents, simply wouldn't understand. Each disagreement at home strengthened Jennifer's reliance on him. Another girl entered the picture, drawn in by the same intensity, the same promises of connection and belonging. Rather than creating jealousy, Paul twisted the situation into something he described as unity, a shared bond that existed beyond ordinary rules. Jennifer accepted it, defended it, protected it. What Susan saw as manipulation, Jennifer saw as loyalty. By the time Susan realized how deeply her daughter had changed, her authority no longer carried weight. The space between them had filled with someone else's voice, someone whose influence thrived on division. And what happened next crossed a line no parent imagines their child could cross. What formed between Jennifer, Paul and the other girl didn't resemble an ordinary teenage relationship. It became a sealed world with its own rules, language, and logic. One that existed separately from school, family, and consequence. Inside it, reality bent easily, reshaped by belief rather than evidence. Paul fed that world constantly. He spoke about identity as something fluid, something that could split and shift depending on desire. He described having another self, not as a metaphor, but as a presence, and insisted this explained why he could care for more than one person at the same time. To him, this wasn't betrayal. It was truth. And to Jennifer, already desperate to feel understood, it sounded convincing. He went further. Paul talked about lives beyond the present one. About souls returning again and again, bound to the same people if they stayed loyal enough. He told the girls that what they shared wasn't temporary, that it stretched far beyond the limits of school or family. If they stayed united, if they refused to let anyone interfere, they would always find one another, no matter the lifetime. We were meant to be together. Other people just don't get it. They're trying to pull us apart. Those ideas were repeated until they felt unquestionable. Jennifer stopped seeing herself as a daughter first. She began to see herself as part of something bigger, something chosen. Anyone who challenged that bond became an enemy by default. Her mother's concerns were no longer about safety. They were about control. Susan's rules weren't boundaries. They were attacks. The other girl absorbed the same beliefs. She idolized Paul, accepted his explanations without hesitation, and mirrored Jennifer's devotion. Instead of rivalry, the two teenagers formed an alliance. They reinforced one another's feelings, validated each other's anger, and framed their isolation as proof that they were different, elevated above everyone else. Conversations between them grew darker. Flashbacks later revealed how casually certain lines were crossed. Discussions that once focused on escaping restrictions turned into complaints about specific people standing in their way. Susan's name surfaced often, not as a mother, not as a person, but as a problem. If she wasn't around, things would be easier. She's the reason we can't be together. She ruins everything. The language shifted. Susan was no longer someone to argue with. She became an obstacle. At the same time, moral distance grew. The group stopped thinking about consequences in real terms. They spoke in hypotheticals, in possibilities, in imagined outcomes where nothing went wrong. They convinced themselves adults wouldn't notice details, that situations could be explained away, that reality would bend to their intentions. Jennifer, once thoughtful and reserved, now defended these ideas without hesitation. The emotional bond she shared with her mother was quietly replaced by loyalty to the group. Susan's exhaustion, her sacrifices, her worry, none of it mattered anymore. Empathy gave way to entitlement. By the time the fantasy fully took hold, running away no longer felt like enough. And then they stopped talking about running away and started talking about removing obstacles. The shift from imagination to intention didn't happen all at once. It crept in through conversations that felt theoretical at first, spoken lightly, without urgency, as if nothing real was being discussed. But over time, those conversations sharpened. Ideas stopped drifting. They began to land. What started as talk about escape turned into talk about removal. The group began to consider specific scenarios, each one more reckless than the last. Their confidence wasn't rooted in knowledge or experience, but in belief. Belief that they were smarter than the adults around them, that they could outthink authority, that outcomes could be shaped simply by wanting them badly enough. One idea centered on electricity. They discussed altering a cord so that contact with water would do the rest. In their minds, it was simple. An accident, something no one would question. They gave no thought to medical examinations or the details that follow sudden deaths. They assumed adults wouldn't look closely. Another plan involved physical force. The thought process was disturbingly shallow. They believed injuries could be ignored, that damage would somehow explain itself away. They spoke about it without fear, without hesitation, not because they were brave, but because they didn't understand what violence actually meant. Then there was poison. Jennifer knew her mother's habits well. She knew what Susan liked, what she trusted. One evening, she prepared a dessert her mother enjoyed and mixed pills into it, confident it would work. When Susan tasted it and rejected it, the failure was brushed aside, not feared. The plan wasn't abandoned out of guilt. It was dismissed as inconvenient. Each failed attempt didn't stop them. It encouraged them. They treated these moments as trial runs, not warnings. Instead of pulling back, they adjusted. They talked through mistakes. They refined ideas. At no point did reality break through the fantasy they had built around themselves. What's striking is how casual it all was. They didn't whisper in fear. They didn't panic. They spoke with certainty, convinced that adults were predictable and systems were easy to bypass. Their understanding of consequence stopped at the moment of action. What came after didn't exist to them. Even the involvement of a younger family member didn't raise alarms in their minds. Authority inside the home had already been weakened. Trust had already been fractured. Manipulation came easily, framed as loyalty and fairness rather than danger. To the outside world, nothing appeared unusual. There were no dramatic warnings, no frantic messages, no sudden disappearances. Just teenagers moving through daily life, carrying plans no one imagined they were capable of forming. And that's what made it so dangerous, because these weren't strangers plotting harm. These were people who lived inside the house, people who knew routines, people who understood habits, people who believed they were untouchable. But none of those plans are what ultimately killed Susan Bailey. That morning began like dozens before it. There was nothing about it that suggested it would end in tragedy. Susan followed her usual routine. She woke up early, moved through the house with quiet familiarity, and prepared for another long day shaped by responsibility. The house felt settled, predictable, the kind of calm that comes from repetition rather than comfort. Whatever tension existed beneath the surface wasn't visible in the way the day unfolded. From Susan's perspective, life was continuing forward. Difficult, yes, but manageable. That morning, she focused on work, on schedules, on obligations that couldn't be postponed. She had no reason to believe the house she lived in, the place she returned to every night, held anything more than the usual challenges of raising teenagers. There were disagreements, but they weren't unusual. Silence, but nothing alarming. Nothing that suggested danger was close. That afternoon passed without incident. Susan went about her responsibilities, unaware of what had already been discussed behind closed doors. The plans, the conversations, the ideas that had moved from abstract to intentional. To her, the house remained a space she controlled through routine and rules. A space she believed was stable, even if imperfect. Inside the home, nothing looked wrong. Rooms were unchanged. Doors were where they always were. Familiar sounds filled the space. If there was tension, it hid well. It didn't announce itself. It didn't demand attention. It waited. As the day stretched into evening, Susan returned home with the weight of exhaustion she had grown used to carrying. She was tired but focused, still thinking ahead, still planning, still trying to manage a household that required constant effort to keep upright. She had no idea how much distance had grown between her and the people around her. That evening, interactions were minimal. Words were exchanged, but not many. Susan didn't sense hostility. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, nothing that forced her to stop and reassess what she believed about her home. That was the danger of it. The absence of chaos felt reassuring. It suggested normalcy. It suggested control. As night settled in, Susan followed her routine once more. The same actions she had repeated countless times. The same trust she placed in the walls around her. The same belief that whatever difficulties existed could be addressed later, tomorrow, next week, someday when things felt easier. She never reached that point. The house didn't change. The people inside it did. What Susan didn't know was that the day had already crossed a threshold. Decisions had already been made. Lines had already been stepped over. By the time she realized something was wrong, there would be no space left to retreat. By the end of the night, the house would never feel like a home again. What happened next did not unfold in chaos. There was no dramatic confrontation that announced itself. No final argument that offered a moment to step back. The violence came quietly, carried out by people Susan trusted enough to share a roof with. Inside the house, Susan was vulnerable. She wasn't bracing for danger. She wasn't preparing to defend herself. She was in a place where defenses drop naturally, where familiarity replaces caution. The people around her were not strangers. They were part of her daily life. Faces she recognized, voices she knew. That closeness is what made escape impossible. Susan didn't have time to process what was happening or why. There was no warning that mattered. No realization that could change the outcome. The betrayal came from within arm's reach, collapsing the distance between mother and child into something unrecognizable. The attack was personal, not impulsive. It wasn't the result of a sudden loss of control. It was the endpoint of conversations that had already stripped Susan of her humanity in the minds of those involved. By the time it happened, she was no longer seen as a mother trying to hold a family together. She had been reduced to an obstacle, something to be removed. And that shift made all the difference. Susan never stood a chance. There was no break in trust beforehand, no final refusal. No moment where she could sense what had been decided behind her back. The house remained silent. Ordinary. Deceptively calm. The same walls that had once felt protective now trapped her inside a decision she didn't know had been made. When it was over, the people responsible didn't flee in panic. They didn't react like individuals overwhelmed by what they'd done. Instead, they moved through the aftermath with the same detachment that had allowed the act itself. The reality of death, permanent, irreversible, still hadn't fully reached them. Inside that house, a line had been crossed that could never be uncrossed. Susan Bailey was gone. Not taken by an intruder, not harmed by someone passing through, but killed by those closest to her. People who had shared meals with her, lived under her rules, depended on her sacrifices. The shock wasn't just that a life had been lost, it was who had taken it. The home that Susan worked so hard to maintain had become the place where her life ended. And nothing about it would ever feel ordinary again. Silence settled in afterward, heavy, final, and unforgiving. And soon that silence would be broken by questions no one inside the house was prepared to answer. When authorities arrived, the house no longer felt like a private space. It became a scene to be examined, measured, and questioned. The calm that had settled after Susan's death didn't last long. What replaced it was scrutiny, and pressure that quickly exposed what silence had been hiding. At first, the accounts coming from inside the house didn't align. Statements were offered that sounded rehearsed, yet incomplete. Details shifted, timelines didn't hold steady. Small contradictions surfaced, not dramatic enough to stand alone, but impossible to ignore when placed side by side. The people involved struggled to keep their stories consistent, especially when asked to explain decisions rather than actions. From an investigator's point of view, the situation was immediately troubling. This wasn't a scene that pointed outward. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of an unknown presence moving through the house. Everything suggested familiarity. Someone who knew the layout, the routines, and the moments when Susan would be least guarded. That narrowed the focus quickly. As questioning continued, emotional cracks began to show. What had once been spoken about with confidence now sounded uncertain. The certainty that had fueled the planning dissolved under direct questioning. Some involved appeared detached, speaking about events without visible emotion. Others showed flashes of anxiety, slipping into silence or contradiction when pressed on specific moments. The fantasy that once insulated them from reality could not survive sustained attention. Piece by piece, the shared story unraveled. Conversations that had been dismissed as meaningless took on new weight. Failed attempts that had once seemed harmless now looked deliberate. The distance they believed existed between intention and outcome vanished. Eventually, the truth surfaced. Confessions followed, not always complete, not always immediate, but enough to establish responsibility. The roles of each person involved became clearer, even as they struggled to grasp the permanence of what had been done. The sense of unity that once held them together fractured as accountability took its place. Arrests were made, charges were filed. The legal process moved forward, indifferent to belief systems or imagined justifications. Age did not erase responsibility. Influence did not remove consequence. Each person faced the reality of what their actions meant within the boundaries of the law. For investigators, the case closed on paper. For the family Susan left behind, there was no closure to be found, only an empty space where a mother had been, and the unbearable knowledge that the danger had never come from outside the home at all. And even as the legal system took control, one question lingered quietly in the background. How so many warnings could exist and still go unanswered? This case forces an uncomfortable question, not about violence itself, but about how easily love, protection, and influence can become confused during adolescence. Teenagers exist in a fragile space between dependence and autonomy. They crave independence, yet still rely heavily on guidance. When that balance breaks, when authority feels like restriction rather than care, resentment can grow quietly. In Susan Bailey's home, rules were meant to provide stability, but to her children, those same boundaries came to represent limitation and denial. Neither side believed they were acting out of harm, and that misunderstanding proved costly. What made this situation especially dangerous was how influence was reframed. Emotional manipulation did not arrive as force or threat. It arrived as understanding, as validation, as reassurance that frustration was justified and opposition was unfair. When someone positions themselves as the sole source of acceptance, they don't need to demand loyalty. It forms naturally. Fantasy played a powerful role as well. Ideas untethered from reality became tools that softened moral limits. When belief systems promise meaning, unity, or escape from discomfort, they can override judgment, especially in young minds still forming their sense of consequence. Reality becomes flexible. Responsibility feels distant. Harm starts to seem theoretical rather than permanent. Warning signs often appear small in real time: changes in behavior, withdrawal, heightened secrecy, escalating resentment. None of these guarantee tragedy on their own. They are easy to dismiss as phases, moods, or growing pains. That's why they're so often overlooked. The danger isn't in missing a single sign. It's in how multiple signals can blend into the background of everyday life. Susan believed she was protecting her children by holding firm. Her children believed they were being denied freedom. Between those two beliefs, communication eroded. And once trust fractured, outside influence filled the space it left behind. This story isn't about blaming authority or excusing rebellion. It's about recognizing how quickly intention and impact can drift apart, and how easily harmful ideas can gain ground when guidance feels absent or misunderstood. So the question remains, long after the case ends, how do we protect without pushing too hard? When the case files were closed and the legal outcome settled, what remained was not resolution. It was absence. Susan Bailey was more than the circumstances of her death. She was a woman who worked long hours so her children wouldn't go without. A mother who chose responsibility over comfort, discipline over ease. Someone who believed that holding a family together sometimes meant being the one who absorbed frustration, anger, and blame. Her life didn't end in public. There was no crowd, no spectacle. It ended quietly, inside a house she believed was safe. And that is what makes the loss so difficult to grasp. Homes are supposed to carry memories forward. In this case, they froze them in place. For those left behind, there was no way to return to normal. Rooms still stood where they always had, but they no longer held the same meaning. Everyday objects became reminders. Silence became heavy. The kind of silence that doesn't fade with time. It settles. Susan's absence wasn't something that could be adjusted to. It was permanent. A gap that couldn't be filled by explanations or legal outcomes. The knowledge of what happened inside that house didn't bring clarity. It brought questions that have no satisfying answers. Could something have been said differently? Could a moment have changed the direction? Could anyone have imagined how far things would go? Those questions linger because this wasn't a story of strangers or chance encounters. It was a story of trust, family, and the fragile line between protection and resentment. A reminder that danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it grows quietly in places we least expect it. Susan Bailey's story is not one of mystery left unsolved. It is one of loss that cannot be undone, a life taken too soon, a family altered forever. A home that will never heal in the way it once might have. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to True Crime Stories Chronicles and share this story because attention keeps victims from being forgotten. And tell me, what moment changed how you saw this case?